June 23, 1941, near Grodno, Lithuania. Oberleutnant Hans von Luck commands a platoon of Panzer III tanks advancing through the morning fog as part of Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union. Von Luck has every reason to feel confident. His Panzer III's have torn through Polish armor in 1939 and crushed French tanks in 1940. The Wehrmacht intelligence briefings assured German tank commanders that Soviet armor is obsolete, poorly maintained, and crewed by peasants with minimal training. Von Luck's 50mm KWK-38 gun has proven capable against every enemy tank encountered so far. But as the fog lifts and his platoon crests a small hill, von Luck sees something that makes his blood run cold. A Soviet tank sitting hull down behind an earthen berm, its turret traversing toward his position. The tank is massive. Its hull sloped at angles von Luck has never seen on a combat vehicle, and even from 800 meters away, he can tell this is nothing like the obsolete T-34's and BT-7s the intelligence officers described. Von Luck orders his gunner to engage immediately, standard doctrine when encountering enemy armor. The Panzer III's 50mm gun fires, the armor-piercing round crossing the distance in less than 2 seconds. Von Luck watches through his commander's optics, expecting to see the satisfying flash of penetration and the smoke that indicates a kill. Instead, he sees a bright spark as the round strikes the Soviet tank's sloped front armor and ricochets skyward, deflecting harmlessly into the sky. His gunner fires again, this time aiming for the turret. Another spark, another deflection. The Soviet tank hasn't moved, hasn't fired back yet, as if its crew is curious to see what the Germans will do next. Von Luck realizes with growing horror that his 50mm gun, which has killed every tank it's faced in 2 years of war, cannot penetrate this Soviet monster at combat ranges. Before he can order his platoon to retreat, the Soviet tank fires. The 76.2mm round tears through his lead Panzer III like it's made of cardboard, the tank exploding in a fireball that kills the crew instantly. This is Germany's introduction to the T-34. And within hours, similar encounters are happening across hundreds of kilometers of front line. German tank crews who began the invasion with supreme confidence find themselves facing Soviet armor that seems immune to their weapons, while carrying a gun powerful enough to destroy any German tank with a single hit. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, commanding a panzer regiment in Army Group South, radios his division commander after losing 6 tanks in an engagement with 3 T-34's. Our 37mm and 50mm guns are ineffective against this new Soviet tank. We scored multiple hits, but achieved no penetrations. Enemy tank destroyed 4 of our Panzer III's and 2 Panzer IV's before withdrawing undamaged. Request immediate clarification on how to engage this threat. Division headquarters has no answers because nobody in the German High Command knew the T-34 existed in significant numbers. The sloped armor that von Luck witnessed deflecting his rounds represents a revolution in tank design that Soviet engineers achieved years before Western designers understood its importance. Traditional tanks feature vertical armor plates because they're easier to manufacture and maximize internal volume. But vertical armor presents its full thickness to incoming projectiles, making penetration relatively straightforward for adequate guns. The T-34's designers, led by Mikhail Koshkin at the Kharkov locomotive factory, angled the front hull armor at 60 degrees from vertical and the turret at 45 degrees. This seemingly simple change transforms the armor's effectiveness dramatically. A 45mm plate angled at 60 degrees presents an effective thickness of 90mm to an incoming round striking perpendicular to the ground. But beyond just increased thickness, the sloped armor causes many rounds to ricochet rather than attempting penetration, their energy deflected away harmlessly into the sky. German tank crews quickly learn that their standard ammunition is nearly useless against T-34's at any range beyond point blank. Lieutenant Otto Karius, who will become one of Germany's most successful tank commanders, describes his first encounter with a T-34 near Jelgava. "We fired 8 rounds at the tank from 600 meters. Every shot hit. We could see the impacts clearly. But the tank continued advancing toward our position. The crew seemed unconcerned, as if our shots were annoying but not threatening. When they finally fired back, our Panzer IV was penetrated through the front plate. We bailed out and watched as the T-34 drove past our burning tank, its armor showing bright silver scars where our rounds had struck, but not a single penetration." The psychological impact of facing an enemy tank you cannot kill, while it can easily kill you, proves devastating to German morale in the invasion's opening weeks. The T-34's gun compounds the armor problem for German forces. The 76.2mm F-34 cannon fires a 6.3-kilogram armor-piercing round at 662 meters per second, giving it penetration capabilities that exceed anything mounted on German tanks in 1941. At 500 meters, the F-34 can penetrate 69 millimeters of vertical armor, more than enough to defeat the 50mm front armor of Panzer III's and the 80mm front of early Panzer IV's. German tankers describe the sound of a T-34's gun as distinctive and terrifying, a deep booming crack that announces certain death if you're in the target tank. Oberleutnant Hans Becker, a Panzer III driver who survives multiple engagements with T-34's, writes in a letter home that the T-34's gun makes our tanks into death traps. One hit anywhere on our tank means fire and death. We've stopped thinking about winning tank battles and started thinking only about surviving them. July 1941. Kharkov, Tank Factory No. 183. Senior designer Alexander Morozov stands in the design bureau looking at technical drawings of the T-34 that are now being vindicated on battlefields across the Western Soviet Union. Morozov was part of Nikolai Koshkin's original design team, and he remembers the skepticism they faced from Soviet military officials when proposing such radical departures from conventional tank design. The sloped armor wasn't just an aesthetic choice or a minor improvement. It represented a fundamental rethinking of how tanks should be protected. Traditional Soviet tanks like the T-26 and BT series featured vertical armor because it was easier to manufacture, maximized internal space, and fit established production methods. But Koshkin's team calculated that sloping the armor would provide dramatically better protection for the same weight, allowing the T-34 to have superior armor while remaining lighter and more mobile than comparable German designs. The mathematics of sloped armor are elegant and devastating to anyone on the receiving end. When a projectile strikes armor at an angle rather than perpendicular, it must penetrate a greater thickness of steel. A 45mm armor plate angled at 60 degrees from vertical forces a projectile to travel through approximately 90 millimeters of steel to reach the interior. But the advantages go beyond simple trigonometry. Sloped armor increases the likelihood of ricochets because projectiles striking at sharp angles tend to deflect rather than attempt penetration, especially if the angle exceeds the projectile's ability to grip the surface. German armor-piercing rounds designed to defeat vertical plates often shatter or deflect when striking the T-34's sloped surfaces. The angling also helps defeat shaped charge weapons, which were just beginning to appear in 1941, by increasing the standoff distance and reducing penetration effectiveness. Morozov's team achieved all this while keeping the T-34's combat weight to just 26.5 tons, making it lighter than the 22-ton Panzer III, despite having far superior protection. The Christie suspension system gives the T-34 mobility that German tanks cannot match, particularly in the mud and snow that characterize the Eastern Front. American engineer J. Walter Christie developed this suspension in the 1930s, featuring large road wheels mounted on independently sprung arms. The Soviets purchased Christie's design when Western armies showed little interest, then refined it for the T-34. The result is a tank that can travel at 55 kilometers per hour on roads and maintain 25 kilometers per hour cross-country, speeds that seem impossible for a vehicle weighing over 26 tons. Oberst Heinrich Eberbach, commanding a Panzer regiment near Smolensk, reports to his superiors that Soviet T-34's are outmaneuvering German tanks in rough terrain, using speed and agility to dictate engagement ranges. Our Panzer III's and IV's become bogged in mud that T-34's traverse easily. They can choose when and where to fight, while we struggle to keep up. The T-34's diesel engine provides advantages that extend beyond simple fuel type. The V234 12-cylinder diesel develops 500 horsepower, giving the tank excellent power-to-weight ratio and remarkable range. German tanks use gasoline engines that are more prone to fires when hit, require more volatile fuel that's dangerous to transport and store, and consume fuel at higher rates. The diesel engine's lower fire risk means T-34 crews have better survival chances when hit, and the 460-kilometer operational range allows Soviet tanks to conduct deep operations without constant refueling. Major General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's premier Panzer commanders, writes in a report to Army High Command that the T-34's diesel engine gives it strategic mobility we cannot match. Soviet tanks can operate for days without refueling, while our Panzers need fuel trucks following close behind. In the vast distances of Russia, this becomes a critical advantage. The wide tracks that support the Christie suspension distribute the T-34's weight over a large surface area, reducing ground pressure to just 0.62 kilograms per square centimeter. By comparison, German Panzer IV's exert nearly double that pressure, causing them to sink into soft ground where T-34's can operate freely. Lieutenant Hans Joachim Marseille, transferred from the Luftwaffe to observe ground operations, writes that watching T-34's cross terrain that stops German armor feels like watching enemy tanks violate the laws of physics. They drive across muddy fields at speed, while our tanks sink to their hulls and must be towed out. In winter, they move across snow that would trap our vehicles. The Eastern Front's terrain favors them in ways our designers never anticipated. The production efficiency of the T-34 design becomes apparent as Soviet factories evacuate eastward ahead of German advances. The tank's sloped armor actually simplifies manufacturing compared to complex compound curves of some Western designs. The V2 diesel engine uses components that Soviet industry can mass produce. The Christie suspension, while sophisticated in concept, proves reliable and maintainable under field conditions. Factory number 183 evacuates from Kharkov to the Urals in late 1941, yet resumes T-34 production within weeks of reaching Nizhny Tagil. By December 1941, Soviet factories are producing T-34's faster than Germany can produce all tank types combined. The design that German engineers admire for its battlefield performance also proves superior in the industrial warfare of mass production. Chief designer Morozov understands that the T-34's true genius lies not just in defeating German shells on the battlefield, but in being a tank that Soviet industry can produce in overwhelming numbers, while German factories struggled to match quality and quantity simultaneously. August 1941, Wolfschanze, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters. General Heinz Guderian stands before Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command, delivering a report that no one wants to hear, but everyone must acknowledge. The T-34 represents a technological superiority we did not anticipate and currently cannot match. Our tank guns are ineffective at combat ranges. Our armor is inadequate against their 76mm cannon. Requesting immediate authorization for emergency anti-tank weapon development and accelerated production of heavy tank designs. Hitler's face reddens as Guderian speaks, not from anger at the general, but from fury that German intelligence failed to detect this threat before Barbarossa began. The Führer demands solutions immediately, asking his generals how the supposedly primitive Soviets managed to produce a tank superior to anything the master race has fielded. The uncomfortable silence that follows tells him everything he needs to know about how badly Germany has been caught off guard. The immediate German response focuses on deploying heavier anti-tank guns because upgrading thousands of existing tanks will take years the Wehrmacht doesn't have. The 88mm flak gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft work, becomes the primary weapon capable of reliably defeating T-34s at reasonable ranges. Hauptmann Albert Ernst commands an 88mm battery near Bryansk and describes the weapon's effectiveness. At 1,000 meters, the 88 will penetrate a T-34's front armor consistently. At 1,500 meters, we still achieve kills with proper aim. But the 88 weighs over 5 tons, requires a large crew to operate, and takes precious minutes to set up for ground engagement. We cannot maneuver these guns like tank destroyers. We must position them defensively and hope the Soviets attack into our fields of fire. The tactical inflexibility of relying on heavy anti-tank guns rather than mobile armor becomes a significant German weakness throughout 1941 and 1942. German tank designers rush to upgrade existing Panzer models with better guns and armor, modifications that prove inadequate but necessary. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support tank with a short 75mm howitzer, receives the long-barreled 75mm KWK-40 gun, capable of penetrating T-34 armor at combat ranges. Additional armor plates are welded onto vulnerable areas, increasing protection but also increasing weight and reducing mobility. Oberst Wilhelm von Thoma, testing the upgraded Panzer IV Ausf F2, reports that the new gun finally gives us parity with the T-34 at medium ranges. We can now penetrate their armor consistently at 800 meters. But these modifications are stopgaps, not solutions. The T-34 still has better mobility, better armor layout, and can be produced in greater numbers than our increasingly complex Panzers. The development of the Tiger heavy tank accelerates dramatically after encountering T-34s, transforming from a long-term project into an emergency priority. The Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 gun can destroy T-34s at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, and its frontal armor remains immune to the T-34's 76mm gun at most combat ranges. Lieutenant Michael Wiedmann, who will become Germany's most successful tank ace, describes his first combat in a Tiger near Leningrad in early 1943. The psychological impact of finally having armor superiority cannot be overstated. We can engage T-34s at ranges where they cannot effectively fight back. But Tigers are also scarce, mechanically unreliable, consume fuel at prodigious rates, and cost 5 times as much to produce as a T-34. Germany produces 1,347 Tigers during the entire war. The Soviets produce over 57,000 T-34s. The Panther medium tank represents Germany's most direct response to the T-34, incorporating sloped armor and a powerful 75mm gun into a design that attempts to match Soviet mobility and protection while maintaining German engineering sophistication. The initial Panthers debut at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, 2 years after German commanders first requested a T-34 counter. Oberst Karl Lorenz commands the 1st Panther Battalion at Kursk, and his after-action report reveals the design's problems. The Panther's armor and gun are excellent, superior to the T-34 in direct combat, but mechanical reliability is catastrophic. Of 200 Panthers committed to battle, 160 broke down from mechanical failures within the first week. Transmission failures, engine fires, fuel pump breakdowns. The Panther is a magnificent tank when it works, but it works far too rarely. The contrast with T-34 reliability, proven across millions of kilometers of operation, highlights Germany's inability to match Soviet pragmatic engineering. The fundamental problem Germany faces is that Soviet tank development focused on practical battlefield effectiveness and mass production from the beginning, while German development prioritized technological sophistication and engineering excellence. The T-34 uses a simple but effective diesel engine that Soviet factories can produce in quantity. German tanks use complex gasoline engines that require precision manufacturing and specialized components. The T-34's sloped armor is simpler to manufacture than the compound curves of later German designs. The Christie suspension, while sophisticated in principle, proves durable and maintainable under field conditions that destroy more complex German systems. By the time Germany develops tanks theoretically superior to the T-34 in one-on-one combat, Soviet industry is producing T-34s at rates that make tactical superiority strategically irrelevant. General Heinz Guderian writes in his memoirs that, "We developed better individual tanks but lost the tank war because we could never match Soviet production. For every Tiger we built, they built 40 T-34s. Mathematics defeats engineering superiority." July 5, 1943. Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. Senior Lieutenant Alexander Oskin commands a T-34 in the 1st Tank Army as part of the massive Soviet defensive operation at the Battle of Kursk. Oskin is a veteran now, having survived nearly 2 years of combat in his T-34, and he understands both the tank's strengths and its significant weaknesses that German tankers have learned to exploit. His tank carries battle scars from previous engagements, hastily repaired armor welds visible on the turret where an 88mm round nearly penetrated last month. As his company advances toward German positions, Oskin knows the T-34's armor advantage from 1941 no longer exists. German tanks and anti-tank guns have caught up, and the invincibility his tank once possessed is now just a memory. The T-34 remains a deadly weapon, but survival now depends on tactics, crew skill, and accepting casualties that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. The T-34's greatest weakness becomes apparent in prolonged engagements where crew efficiency matters as much as armor and guns. The tank's interior is cramped, forcing the commander to also serve as the main gunner, a dual role that reduces situational awareness and slows engagement times. Oskin must acquire targets, aim the gun, fire, assess results, and command his crew simultaneously. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger separate these roles, allowing commanders to focus purely on tactics while dedicated gunners handle firing. Oberst Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, commanding a Tiger battalion at Kursk, exploits this T-34 weakness ruthlessly. Soviet tanks take longer to acquire and engage targets because their commanders are overloaded. We engage them while they're still searching for us. A Tiger with a dedicated commander and gunner can destroy 2 or 3 T-34's before they properly coordinate a response. The Soviet solution is numerical superiority, accepting that multiple T-34's must attack each German heavy tank to guarantee kills. The T-34's two-man turret creates communication problems that German three-man turrets don't face. Oskin's crew consists of himself as commander-gunner, a loader who also operates the whole machine gun, a driver, and a radio operator who also serves as hull gunner. Coordinating these roles in combat proves difficult without the dedicated crew positions German tanks employ. Lieutenant Ivan Yakubov, commanding a T-34 company at Kursk, describes the communication chaos. "I'm trying to identify targets, aim the gun, give firing commands, coordinate with my loader, and communicate with other tanks over radio. German commanders just command, while their gunners and loaders handle weapons. This gives them faster reaction times and better tactical flexibility. Soviet doctrine compensates by massing T-34's in overwhelming numbers, using quantity to overcome the qualitative disadvantage in crew efficiency." German tankers, by 1943, have developed tactics specifically designed to defeat T-34's by exploiting their weaknesses rather than confronting their strengths. Lieutenant Otto Karius, now commanding Tigers, teaches his crews to engage T-34's at maximum range, where German optic superiority and crew organization provide decisive advantages. At 1,500 meters, our gunner can accurately target T-34's, while their commander gunners struggle to acquire us. We destroy them before they close to ranges where their numerical advantage becomes overwhelming. German tactics emphasize long-range gunnery, hull-down defensive positions, and using terrain to force T-34's into killing zones, where German guns can engage multiple targets sequentially. These tactics work because they turn the T-34's strengths into irrelevant factors. Sloped armor doesn't help if you're hit at extreme range by an 88mm gun. Speed doesn't matter if you're channeled into prepared kill zones. The Battle of Kursk exposes the T-34's vulnerabilities, while also demonstrating why Soviet armor doctrine succeeds despite these problems. Soviet forces at Kursk deploy over 3,000 T-34's against roughly 900 German tanks, including 200 Tigers and Panthers. German tanks achieve superior kill ratios, individual Tigers destroying 10 or more T-34's during the battle. But the Soviets can afford to lose tanks at 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 ratios because their production capacity replaces losses within weeks. Germany cannot replace its destroyed armor at anywhere near Soviet rates. Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrinenko, who survives Kursk in his T-34, despite taking multiple hits that killed previous crew members, understands the brutal calculus. We lose 3 tanks for every German tank destroyed, but we have 3 more tanks to send forward. Eventually, the Germans run out of tanks, out of fuel, out of ammunition. We keep coming. This is not elegant warfare. This is industrial warfare, where production capacity determines victory. The T-34's legacy from the Battle of Kursk forward is complex. It remains the backbone of Soviet armored forces, but its dominance comes from numbers rather than individual superiority. the Soviets begin developing the T-34-85 with an 85mm gun and three-man turret to address the most critical weaknesses. But even this improved model never achieved the individual technical superiority the original T-34 possessed in 1941. German Tigers and Panthers outclassed T-34-85s in direct combat throughout 1944 and 1945. Yet Germany loses the tank war decisively because they cannot produce advanced tanks fast enough to matter strategically. The T-34's true genius wasn't in being the best tank, but in being a good enough tank that could be produced in overwhelming numbers, maintained under harsh conditions, and operated by hastily trained crews. Senior Lieutenant Oskin survives the war, having destroyed numerous German tanks, and when asked about the T-34's effectiveness, his answer is pragmatic. It wasn't the best tank in the world, but it was good enough, and there were enough of us that good enough was sufficient to win.
January 1944. Kharkov Tank Factory, now relocated to the Urals. Chief designer Alexander Morozov examines the prototype of the T-34-85, the upgraded version that addresses the most critical flaws exposed to Kursk. The new tank features an 85mm Zeiss S-53 gun capable of penetrating Tiger armor at combat ranges, something the original 76mm could not reliably achieve. More importantly, the turret has been redesigned to accommodate 3 crew members, finally giving Soviet tanks the separated commander and gunner roles that German tanks have exploited for years. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Lavrenenko, recalled from the front to evaluate the new design, climbs into the turret and immediately notices the difference. "I can actually command now instead of trying to aim and shoot while directing my crew. The loader has proper space to work. This is the tank we needed in 1941, but having it now means we can finally engage German heavy tanks on more equal terms." The 85mm gun transforms the T-34 from a tank that must rely on numerical superiority into one capable of threatening any German armor. The Zeiss S-53 can penetrate 102 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, sufficient to defeat Tiger I frontal armor at combat ranges and threaten even the formidable Panther from the side. Oberst Karl Lorenz, whose Panther battalion survived Kursk, encounters T-34-85s during the Soviet winter offensive of 1944 and reports to his superiors that the tactical situation has shifted. Soviet tanks are no longer helpless at range. Their new 85mm gun can kill Panthers frontally at 800 meters and Tigers from the flank at similar ranges. We no longer have the luxury of engaging them at our preferred distances with impunity. Combined with their numerical superiority, this creates serious problems for our defensive operations. The T-34-85 doesn't make Soviet tanks individually superior to German heavy armor, but it narrows the capability gap enough that Soviet numbers become overwhelming. Production of the T-34-85 begins in early 1944, and Soviet industry demonstrates once again its ability to rapidly implement design changes without disrupting output. Factories transition from T-34-76 to T-34-85 production while actually increasing overall output, producing over 29,000 T-34-85s by war's end. Senior Lieutenant Alexander Oskin, now a company commander, receives his first T-34-85 in March 1944 and leads it into combat during Operation Bagration,
the massive Soviet offensive that destroys German Army Group Center. The new tank proves its worth immediately. Oskin's company engages a force of Panther tanks near Minsk, and for the first time he fights German heavy armor without accepting that multiple T-34's must die to kill each enemy tank. We destroyed 3 Panthers in that engagement and lost only 1 T-34. The 85mm gun levels the playing field enough that crew skill and tactics matter more than simple vehicle specifications. Soviet Combined Arms Doctrine by 1944 maximizes T-34's effectiveness by integrating armor with artillery, infantry, and air support in ways that German forces, increasingly short on resources, cannot match. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's offensives feature massive artillery barrages that suppress German anti-tank defenses, allowing T-34 waves to break through positions that would have been impenetrable in 1941. The Soviets have learned from their costly mistakes in the war's early years, no longer sending tanks forward unsupported or attacking prepared positions without proper reconnaissance. Major Ivan Yakubov, commanding a tank battalion in the drive toward Poland, describes the evolved doctrine. We never attack without artillery preparation anymore. Infantry clears anti-tank guns from our path. If we encounter heavy German armor in prepared positions, we call for air support or artillery rather than charging into kill zones. The T-34 remains our primary weapon, but it's now part of a system rather than being expected to win battles alone. The advance toward Germany in 1944 and 1945 sees T-34s operating in conditions where their reliability and ease of maintenance prove as valuable as their combat capabilities. German tanks, increasingly complex and mechanically temperamental, break down in alarming numbers as supply lines collapse and spare parts become unavailable. The T-34's simple, robust design keeps Soviet armor moving even under harsh conditions with minimal maintenance. Lieutenant Josef Mueller, commanding a King Tiger in the defense of Berlin, watches his battalion's strength dwindle, not from combat losses, but from mechanical failures that cannot be repaired. We started the Berlin defense with 22 King Tigers. By the time Soviet forces reached the city center, only 6 remained operational. The others broke down and had to be abandoned. Meanwhile, Soviet T-34s that we damaged often returned to combat within days after field repairs. German engineering excellence created unreliable monsters. Soviet pragmatism created dependable workhorses. The final push into Berlin demonstrates the T-34's role in the complete collapse of German resistance. Over 6,000 Soviet tanks, predominantly T-34-85s, surround and assault the German capital in April 1945. The urban combat exposes the T-34 to close-range Panzerfaust attacks and German anti-tank guns positioned in buildings. Yet Soviet numerical superiority and combined arms tactics prove unstoppable. Senior Lieutenant Oskin, who survives the entire war from 1941 to 1945 in T-34s, commands his company during the final assault on the Reichstag. We lost tanks to Panzerfausts and hidden anti-tank guns, but for every tank we lost, 3 more advanced to take its place. German defenders fought desperately, but they couldn't be everywhere at once, and we were everywhere. His T-34-85 is one of the first Soviet tanks to reach the Brandenburg Gate. The sloped armor that confused German gunners in 1941, now scarred and dented from 4 years of combat, but still intact, still advancing, still part of the unstoppable tide that brought the Soviet flag to Berlin and ended the war in Europe.
May 1945. Kubinka Tank Proving Grounds near Moscow. American and British liaison officers stand alongside Soviet engineers examining captured German tanks, including Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers that now serve as trophies and study subjects. Colonel James Polk of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department walks around a Tiger II, marveling at its thick armor and powerful 88mm gun, then turns to examine a battle-worn T-34-85 parked nearby. The contrast is striking. The German tank is a monument to engineering complexity, while the Soviet tank looks almost crude by comparison. Yet Polk understands what the numbers prove. The T-34 won the tank war not through individual superiority, but through a combination of adequate capability and overwhelming production. Soviet chief designer Alexander Morozov, present for the evaluation, tells the American officers something they need to understand. We did not try to build the best tank in the world. We tried to build a good enough tank that our factories could produce in the quantities needed to win. The Germans built masterpieces. We built weapons of war. The T-34's influence on post-war tank design proves immediate and profound as every nation examines the lessons of armored warfare. Sloped armor becomes standard on virtually every main battle tank designed after 1945, from the American M48 Patton to the British Centurion to the Soviet T-54. The concept that the T-34 pioneered, maximizing armor effectiveness through angling rather than thickness alone, transforms from Soviet innovation to universal doctrine. British tank designer Sir Michael Dewar writes in his post-war analysis that the T-34 taught us that armor geometry matters as much as armor thickness. Every modern tank owes a debt to Korshkin's team for proving that sloped plates provide superior protection at lower weight. The Tiger and Panther attempted to copy this advantage late in the war, but the T-34 established it as fundamental tank design principle. The T-34 remains in production long after World War II ends, with Soviet factories continuing to build T-34-85s until 1958, and licensed production in other countries extending even further. Over 84,000 T-34s of all variants are produced during and after the war, making it the second most produced tank in history. The design serves in conflicts across the globe, from the Korean War, where T-34-85s face American M26 Pershings and M46 Pattons, to the Middle East, where Syrian and Egyptian T-34s fight Israeli armor in multiple wars. Lieutenant Colonel David Eshel of the Israeli Defense Forces encounters T-34-85s during the Six-Day War in 1967 and reports that even our modern Centurion and M48 tanks treat them with respect. The T-34 is obsolete by 1960 standards, but its gun can still kill modern tanks if it achieves a flank shot, and its armor still deflects some hits through that remarkable slope design. The human cost of the T-34's design philosophy deserves acknowledgement alongside its technical achievements. Soviet tank crews suffered casualty rates that would be unacceptable by Western standards. With cramped interiors, poor ergonomics, and tactical doctrine that prioritized mass assault over crew survivability. Senior Lieutenant Alexander Oskin survived the war, but he was exceptional. The average T-34 crew member in 1943 to 1944 had a life expectancy measured in weeks once committed to combat. Soviet archives released after the Cold War revealed that approximately 44,000 T-34s were destroyed during the war,
And while many crews escaped burning tanks, the casualties remained staggering. The two-man turret that persisted until the T-34-85 cost countless lives because overworked commanders couldn't spot threats quickly enough. The T-34 won through numbers that made individual losses strategically acceptable, a philosophy that Western democracies could never embrace. German tankers who survived the war almost universally express respect for the T-34, despite having fought against it. Otto Carius, who destroyed over 150 Soviet tanks during the war, writes in his memoir that the T-34 was the most significant tank of World War II, not because it was unbeatable, but because it was good enough and there were so many. We could destroy 10 T-34's and feel victorious, then realize that 20 more were advancing to replace them. Quality cannot overcome that level of quantity, especially when the quality gap narrows over time. Oberst Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, who commanded German armor on the Eastern Front throughout the war, tells American interrogators in 1945 that underestimating the T-34 in 1941 was one of Germany's greatest strategic mistakes. We planned for a quick victory over primitive Soviet forces. Instead, we found ourselves fighting a technically sophisticated enemy who could outproduce us 20-1. The final verdict on the T-34 must balance its revolutionary design against the brutal realities of how it was employed. The tank's sloped armor changed warfare by proving that geometry could substitute for thickness, that 45 millimeters of properly angled steel could defeat guns designed to penetrate 80 millimeters of vertical plate. Its mobility, reliability, and firepower gave Soviet forces a weapon that could fight effectively in conditions that destroyed more complex German tanks. But the T-34's greatest achievement was being a design that Soviet industry could mass produce while maintaining adequate quality, allowing the USSR to field armored forces that simply overwhelmed German defenders through numbers. It wasn't the best tank of World War II in individual combat. The Tiger, Panther, and late-war Allied designs surpassed it. But it was the most important tank of the war because it combined good enough capability with overwhelming quantity, proving that in industrial warfare, production capacity matters more than technical perfection. The sloped armor that shocked German gunners in 1941 became the standard that all future tanks would follow, ensuring that the T-34's influence would extend far beyond the battlefield, where it earned its reputation as the tank that broke the Wehrmacht and carried the Soviet flag to Berlin.